Okay, year 10. So I'm just going to give you a little lecture today on detente, okay? Um, Now, obviously, you've done your Cold War paper and you have submitted that to me. I'm going to go through the feedback on that when you guys start to come in the next few weeks rather than trying to do it all individually online, okay? Now, before that paper, there was one last topic we didn't actually have the time to cover before the exam, which is detente. Okay, so detente is the last topic that you need to know for the Cold War, because remember, you need to know the course up until 1973, what is sometimes called the First Cold War, that period from 1945 to 1973. So we're just going to go through that quickly. I'm going to give you a few questions to do at the end. Um, Now, you've got this knowledge organizer, which I've made first of all, and that is on show my homework. Okay, so you can get that off of there. You might find it useful to have it in front of you. So I've, for example, got my one here. If you've got a printer, you might find it useful to print it out just so you can follow some of the key events as we're going through them. Okay. So to start off with, détente. Okay. And what does it actually mean? Okay, now it's a French word, and literally the meaning of the word. And I'll just quickly, if you want to quickly get a title down, just make it détente. Okay, so just get the title down in your book or in your line of paper and make it détente. Forgot to say that before. Okay, so now that you've got your title of détente, and if you don't just pause here and quickly get that down, what does the word détente actually mean? Okay, now it's a French word, and it refers to the easing of hostility or strained relations, especially between countries. Okay, so it refers to the idea of like a relaxation of tensions. Okay, so we've seen in the Cold War that there are these moments where the relationship between the Soviet Union and the US really hots up. It gets quite dangerous. And we've seen there are other periods where actually it cools down quite a lot and there are periods of improved cooperation and less strained relations. Okay. So if we think about, for example, during the Second World War, the Soviets and the US worked together to defeat the Nazis. Then at the end of the war, we obviously see that you get these growing tensions over what's going to happen in Eastern Europe and the Berlin blockade. And then you get the shift to Asia with things like the Korean War, and the tensions get worse. It gets much hotter. Um, but then we also saw that in the late 1950s, when Khrushchev was elected, and the relationship improved a lot, and you got the Khrushchev thaw. Until then, again, the relationship got a lot more tense with things like the building of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so the period we're looking at today, Dayton, refers to this period after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where relations begin to ease, they become less tense, and there's a relaxation in tension between the two sides. Okay, so make sure you've got a definition of that keyword in your notes. Okay, now there are three main causes for detente, which we're going to go through today, the most important ones. Okay, now the first two are kind of like bigger things to do with like the arms race and nuclear weapons, and the third one is a slightly different one. Now, the first key cause of detente, this improved relationship between the Soviets and the US in the late 1960s, was because of the growing threat of nuclear war. Okay, now we saw when we looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis that the US and the Soviets had come very, very close to an all-out nuclear confrontation. Remember, we saw the anecdote of the Soviet submarine which tried to break through the Cuban blockade that the US had set up, and that very nearly had led out to an all-out nuclear war. We then saw that in the year after that, to try and reduce the possibility of nuclear war, there was obviously the hotline set up between the White House and the Kremlin. And we also saw the year after the crisis in 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was passed, which banned nuclear weapon tests anywhere but underground. And in some ways, this is seen as a kind of precursor to Dayton. Okay, relationships are still very tense in 1963, the year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's the first example of kind of cooperation between the Soviets and the US after that. So that showed you one example of how the threat of nuclear war led to a sense that détente was needed between the sides. The other big thing you had was that obviously there was a growing awareness, particularly in like the US and Britain, of the threat that nuclear war posed. Okay, so we saw that you had the growth of things like the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So there was a lot of pressure on the US and British governments, particularly, to try and negotiate with the Soviets to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Another factor which made people more concerned about the possibility of nuclear war as well was that in 1964, Mao's China tested its first nuclear bomb. Now, the reason that concerned both the Soviets and the US is that Mao's China was seen as a particularly kind of dangerous and erratic government. So it showed the risks of the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries with more unstable regimes. And it made the two sides think that they had to put a limit on the arms race and try to stop the spread of nuclear technology to other countries. Okay, so they had this growing threat of nuclear war. Second one, much more simply, was just the growing cost of the arms race. Okay, so I've shown you this graph before. So this shows you the amount of nuclear warheads built by both sides during the Cold War. And you can see throughout the sort of 60s, the amount of nuclear weapons that both sides have is absolutely enormous. Okay, by the end of the 1970s, both sides have 25,000 nuclear warheads. Okay, and the cost of that just wasn't sustainable, particularly for the Soviet Union, because the important thing to remember is, although the Soviet Union was a great superpower like the US, it was a much poorer country than America. So to get the same number of nuclear weapons as the United States was a much bigger drain on the Soviet Union's economy. So because of that, both sides had an economic interest in trying to put a limit on the arms race and reduce the cost of nuclear weapons. Now, the third cause of détente, which is slightly more complicated, is you have in the late 60s something called the Sino-Soviet split, okay? Now, the Sino-Soviet split refers to Sino being China, Soviet being obviously Russia, the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split refers to this growing division between the Soviet Union and Communist China that began in the late 1950s and really reached a peak in the mid-1960s. And the reason it was important was the split between China and the Soviet Union meant that the US felt able to negotiate with each one separately and almost play them off against each other. And the fact that they weren't having to face like a united communist bloc of China and the Soviet Union made the Americans feel more confident about carrying out negotiations. Okay, but very briefly, why was there this Sino-Soviet split, this split between the Soviet Union and China? Now, we saw obviously that in 1949, after Mao successfully completed the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, we saw, didn't we, that he signed the Treaty of Friendship with China, with the Soviet Union. So Stalin and Mao signed this Treaty of Friendship, which leads to the Soviets sending lots of technical experts and money and military trainers to China to help prop up the communist government. And Mao was a big admirer of Stalin. Okay, so they had this very close relationship after 1950. Now, what began to change that, though, was obviously we saw that Stalin then died in 1953, and Mao, although Stalin had actually in some ways exploited China somewhat with the Treaty of Friendship, Mao was a great admirer of Stalin. Okay, so when Stalin died, he lost kind of like the key person for him within the Soviet regime that he really admired. And obviously we also saw that then the person who took over from Stalin was Khrushchev. And we saw that in 1956, one of probably the most famous thing Khrushchev did was he made this secret speech attacking Stalin and his legacy. So he denounced Stalin for the crimes he committed while he was in power. He'd admitted the extent to which Stalin had been a ruthless dictator that had killed, millions of his own people through both the famines and the Great Purges. And it was a really shocking moment for lots of people in the communist world who'd admired Stalin and hadn't, wanted to or hadn't known about Stalin's crimes. And that began to turn Mao against the Soviet Union. He accused them of what he called revisionism. So he basically said that Khrushchev was abandoning the original communist goal, and he didn't like his criticisms of Stalin, who Mao greatly admired. There are lots of more complicated things we don't need to go into, but it was also to do with like who China thought the people that would make the communist revolution would be. So in China, they thought that it should be the peasantry. In traditional Soviet theory, it was meant to be like the industrial proletariat, the working class in the cities who would make a revolution. So they had differences in revolutionary theory as well. But the key breaking point really was Khrushchev's rejection of Stalin. That's what led to Mao gradually distancing himself from the Soviet Union. And it eventually meant that by the early 1960s, the Soviets and China are actually almost in direct conflict. Remember, the Soviet Union and China share a border, and at one point, it even looks like they might be going to war. So this rivalry has become really, really serious by the end of the 1960s. And the new American president, Richard Nixon, he sees this rivalry between China and the Soviet Union, and he thinks it is an opportunity to exploit the differences between the two sides. So you get this process of what's nicknamed ping pong diplomacy. Now it's nicknamed ping pong diplomacy because when the United States tries to begin negotiations with China to try and build a sort of alliance with China against the Soviet Union to try and push the Soviets into having to make an alliance with the US as well, or negotiate with the US as well. One of the first things they do to try and improve relations between America and China is they send the American ping pong team to China to take part in a competition against China's best ping pong players. So it was kind of like the opening of this process of trying to negotiate with a better relationship with China. If you've ever seen the film Forrest Gump, there's actually a scene where Forrest Gump is one of the American athletes who goes to China to take part in this ping pong tournament. So that's what in the film that is a reference to. And the sort of high point of ping pong diplomacy is in 1972. Richard Nixon, the president at that time, becomes the first American president to visit communist China. So you can see a picture of him here shaking hands with Chairman Mao, and then negotiate a trade agreement between America and China. And that puts a lot of pressure on the Soviets to create their own set of treaties with the US because they become concerned that America and China are sort of drawing so close together, and it means that the Soviets feel under pressure to negotiate with the Americans as well. Now, just a little bit on the leaders that made détente possible, because it's a little bit surprising when we consider their biographies. Now, going back to this person here, Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon became the president of America after Lyndon Johnson. Okay, so you remember we have President Kennedy, who was then assassinated in 1963. He's replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who is president then until 1968. Lyndon Johnson then steps down, and Richard Nixon wins the 1968 presidential election. Okay, now Richard Nixon, in some ways, is someone who is quite surprising. Would have led America into an improved relationship with the Soviet Union. Now, the reason for that is that Nixon had been at the top of American politics for a very long time. You can see him here. He was the vice president for Eisenhower. So Eisenhower was president of America for 8 years in the 1950s. Richard Nixon was his vice president. Nixon actually ran against Kennedy in the 1960 general election and lost. So he'd actually stood for president once before. And actually, Nixon's reputation as Eisenhower's vice president was as a really, really strong anti-communist. He'd actually been a leading supporter of Senator McCarthy and McCarthyism. So he was probably the most strongly anti-communist person within Eisenhower's whole administration. So again, it was quite surprising that he would be the president who would end up leading the US into a better relationship with the Soviet Union. And likewise, Leonid Brezhnev becomes leader slightly earlier than Nixon. Now, we saw that Brezhnev obviously replaced Khrushchev in 1964. So in 1964, Khrushchev was overthrown in an army coup that was led by Brezhnev. And Brezhnev was seen as a much more hard-line Soviet leader. He'd, like Khrushchev, been in Stalin's government. And one of the reasons why he'd overthrown Khrushchev was that he saw him as a weak leader. So he was a much more hard-line communist leader. And obviously, that was really underlined when what we saw last time, when he ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 to crush the Prague Spring. So he was seen as a much more ruthless, hard-line communist leader. And again, somewhat surprising that he would be the person to lead the Soviet Union into a better relationship with America. But nevertheless, they did seem to work well together. And the historians have sort of speculated that, well, one reason for that was the fact that, the fact that they'd both been at the top of politics in their own countries for years had meant they'd seen the real impact of the arms race and how close both countries had come to nuclear war on numerous occasions. But the other thing was probably that they had, they wouldn't have admitted it, but they probably had quite a lot in common. They were quite ruthless, powerful men who'd been at the top of the sort of tree of power for a long time. And they probably saw something of each other in one another. So despite the fact that, Nixon was a, very, very notoriously anti-communist vice president in the 1950s, and Brezhnev was seen as a much more hardline communist leader than Khrushchev, they were able to work together to negotiate this period of improved relations. And probably the most important outcome of Dayton, the most sort of famous event that it led to, was the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. You only need to remember it as SALT 1, so that's the acronym. It's a bit like NATO. As long as you know the acronym, you don't need to remember what it stands for. But the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, as you can imagine, are about putting limits on the amount of strategic arms that both sides have, i.e. nuclear weapons. So these are talks that were designed to put a limit on the number of nuclear weapons each side had as a way of reducing the cost of the arms race and trying to improve relations while putting a limit on the amount of nuclear weapons each side had. So particularly it put a limit on the amount of anti-ballistic missile systems each side had. So one problem before was that one of the reasons why both sides were beginning to stack up loads and loads of nuclear weapons they didn't actually need was because each side was building these anti-missile defense systems. It meant that you had to build thousands and thousands of missiles because obviously if some of them could be shot down on the way to their targets, you had to build more than were actually needed. So they put a limit on the amount of anti-ballistic missile systems to try and limit the arms race in that way. They also put a cap on the number of ballistic missiles and nuclear submarine each side had. So they set a limit on how many of each type of weapon each side could have. And the idea was that they would get to that number and then they would stay there. And the idea behind that was that later on, they were planning to negotiate to actually cut down the amount of nuclear weapons they had. But for now, the idea was let's put a cap on the total number we can make, and that will put a ceiling on the arms race and bring the arms spending under control as a kind of first step. That agreement is signed at the Moscow summit in May 1972. So you can see Richard Nixon here with his cabinet in Moscow, shaking hands with Brezhnev, having just signed the SALT 1 treaty. Seen as an enormous success for both leaders, Richard Nixon was actually re-elected very shortly afterwards in November 1972, partly standing on his record as having improved relations with the Soviets whilst not appearing weak. So both of them had their sort of prestige and standing improved by these talks. And then what you get for the sort of the rest of the mid 70s is, an improved relationship between the Soviets and the US. In 1973, the US ends the Vietnam War. So it had been clear for a number of years that that was going to happen. But in 1973, the final US troops left Vietnam. So the Vietnam War came to an end. So one of the key hotspots of the Cold War came to an end. You then had another treaty signed between the Soviets and the Americans called the Helsinki Accords in 1975. So you can see Brezhnev here with Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford. That accord basically improved trade between the Soviets and the US and also put in certain guarantees about human rights in both countries. And then also we saw this before when we looked at the space race, if you can remember. As a symbolic act of their improved relationship, and the Soviets and US also agreed to a joint space mission. So to sort of highlight the fact that they were now working together and not just against each other, they decided to carry out this joint mission in space between a American astronaut and a Soviet cosmonaut team, which was the highlight of which was these two teams meeting in orbit and then shaking hands in space. Now, that's kind of like the period of Détente then. So you get the signing of the SALT 1 talks, which is sort of like the peak of Détente, and then you get this period of improved relations in the mid-1970s. Now, Détente did come to an end at the end of the 1970s, though, which goes beyond our course, but it's probably worth mentioning. Now, there are a few reasons for that, but the most important ones really were in 1979, America and the Soviet Union had agreed a new set of nuclear weapon talks called the SALT II. talks, which would have began cutting down the amount of nuclear weapons each side had. But that was derailed by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And the reason that was important was that when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it meant that the American Congress responded by refusing to ratify the SALT II treaty. So SALT II was basically torn up. And very shortly after that, there was a new American president elected, Ronald Reagan. Okay. Now, Ronald Reagan, unlike Nixon, was much less willing to negotiate with the Soviet Union. He famously described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. He was a strongly Christian man, so he, saw the sort of Soviet Union as this godless, dictatorial empire, and he launched what some historians have called the Second Cold War. So this new period of rivalry in the 1980s. So for the last 10 years of the Cold War, relations got much worse again. You had major conflicts in Central America, where hundreds of thousands of people died in proxy wars there, but also in Angola and northeastern Africa. So there was this period of then much, much worse relations after that. Okay, so just a quick review before I set you over your questions. So we looked at what détente was. We looked at the three main reasons why it happened: so the threat of nuclear war, the cost of the arms race, the Sino-Soviet split. We then looked at Nixon and Brezhnev and why, despite being both sort of hardline leaders, they were able to work together. We then saw the sort of peak of the period of détente was the signing of the SALT I treaty in 1972. We then saw some of these examples of the improved relationship in the 1970s. And then finally, why détente came to an end. And then you got a second Cold War in the 1980s between the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, now, all I want you to do now, please, year 10, is if you go to pages 90 to 93 in your textbooks, I have 10 questions for you here that I'd like you to answer. So these first 5 are from pages 90 to 91, and these ones here, 6 to 10, are on pages 92 to 93. These need to be in full sentences. So I'll say that twice for you, Jaffa. You need to have them in full sentences, okay? Once you've done that, I'd like you to take a picture of your completed work and send it to me. Now, that's the first thing you've got to do. So you've got to answer those 10 questions using those 4 pages. The second thing you've got to do is I have set a quiz on Show My Homework. I'd like you to complete that. So both of those things are going to be due for 1 p.m. Friday. So I need to have a picture of your completed work of these 10 questions on lined paper or in your exercise book. And I also need you to have completed that quiz by Friday. Okay, when you start coming into school, guys, I'm going to give you your feedback on your exams then. I'm really looking forward to seeing you. Remember, if you've missed any of the other prior lessons, you can go back earlier in the playlist and you can complete the work from there, because I will be checking when you come in what work you've managed to complete while you've been off, okay? So once you've done those 2 things, if there's any gaps in your work, go back through the playlist and you can work on those topics, okay? Right, look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.